Hi everybody, we're going to pick back up with the nervous system. We're looking at the central nervous system right now and brain functions. If you're following me in the course pack, let's start on page 114. But I would encourage you to look over on page 116. There's a picture of a brain. If you can pull those two and have them available, that's what we're going to work on first. So first I'd like to help you label the brain. So on page 114, we're going to talk through several areas of the brain and their functions. In order to understand where each of these are located, I'm going to run down the list in the second column for location. So I have page 114 handy, and then the picture, of course, here is from 116. First of all, let's go ahead and label the four lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Now, in order to know which one is the frontal lobe, I need to know the front part of the brain from the back part of the brain. And the way I do that is I know that this piece back here called the cerebellum is at the back part of the brain. So I'm going to go ahead and label that cerebellum. I'm going to put a P back here for posterior, an A over here for anterior. Okay, so that way I know which is the front side from the back side. By the way, you're looking at the left hemisphere of the cerebellum and cerebrum for that matter, so I'm going to put an L down there. All right, so now I know where the frontal lobe is located. If I draw a line right through here and come around right about here, this portion is going to be the frontal lobe. Let's see, we also have the parietal lobe. So from that same point, going back to about right there, let's say that this area here is parietal lobe. We also have the occipital lobe back here at the back part of the brain. And over here on the side, roughly in that area there, is temporal lobe. So what we've labeled are the four lobes of the cerebrum. The cerebellum is this piece here at the back of the brain. Now let's see, we also need to look at the precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus. You may recall a gyrus is a hill of tissue, while a sulcus is a groove. Now a deep groove is called a fissure. So I'm going to go here between the frontal and parietal lobes. This area right through here, that is going to be called our precentral gyrus. And let's circle the piece right behind it, right through there, and we're going to call that our postcentral gyrus. Now, you probably noticed there was a small groove between those two, like right through here. Okay, I'm just going to emphasize that groove right through there. That we're going to call a central sulcus. All right, so we've got the precentral gyrus is part of the frontal lobe. The postcentral gyrus is part of the parietal lobe. What separates the two is a groove called the central sulcus. Okay, so far so good. Now, while we're labeling, let's go ahead and add some notes on here. The occipital lobe back here at the back is home to vision. The temporal lobe is home to smell, and what else? Hearing. The frontal lobe is home to a couple of things. There's an area right through here called the prefrontal cortex. It's home to your memories, your decision-making skills, what they call decorum and toilet training. But let's instead now focus on that portion called the precentral gyrus. What does the precentral gyrus do for us? It's voluntary motor control. How about the postcentral gyrus? Well, it's found in the parietal lobe, and it's involved in somatic sensation. And what that means is what you can feel. Not what you see or hear, but what you can feel. All right, so we've taken care of smell, hearing, vision. We haven't covered taste. Taste is actually found here in the parietal lobe, around right here. Okay, speech is often in the left hemisphere, and we've talked about this prefrontal cortex. Let's go ahead and label that. We'll just simply say behavior. So you'll want to be able to identify these parts on a brain for the lecture test, that is. You'll want to be able to know what each of these regions is responsible for doing, and especially our new areas such as pre- and post-central gyrus. You'll want to be able to discuss what they do. So that's where I'm taking you next, is through a conversation on page 114. We're going to walk through that chart together. So let's talk about voluntary motor control. Voluntary motor controls originates with your conscious thoughts. Those conscious thoughts come from the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is located in which lobe? That's your frontal lobe. Okay? It sits in front of this central sulcus. I'll circle that central sulcus right there. So when you're thinking about moving a body part, like if you're going to pick up your pencil to write, those conscious thoughts originate in the precentral gyrus. They travel down through your spinal cord and out the appropriate spinal nerve so that you can move and do your writing. In the precentral gyrus, on each hemisphere of your brain, you have what's called a primary motor cortex homunculus. The homunculus is this strange-looking, not proportionate drawing of the body. You'll notice there's a lot of motor control dedicated to the face and to the hands. There isn't a lot of motor control dedicated to areas like simply movable joints, like elbows, knees, hips, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of fine-tuned motor control that has to go into hands and facial movements, and that's why there's more surface area of the brain dedicated to those areas. I should also remind you that we have contralateral control here, meaning the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body. Likewise, the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. So this is in the pre-central gyrus of the frontal lobe, and this is a mapping to where these movements originate. Now, when you decide that you're going to pick up a pencil and write, watch where this nerve impulse has to go. It travels from the cerebral cortex in the precentral gyrus. It travels down through descending tracts. These are the descending tracts right here. And they travel down your spinal cord, crossing over the gray commissure right about there. When they travel across the gray commissure, they are still traveling through descending tracts right here, and then they go back into the gray matter and they come out the appropriate horn. Now, thinking back, does voluntary motor control come out of the lateral horn of gray matter or the ventral horn of gray matter? Voluntary motor control comes from the ventral horn. So that's where we're coming from, is right there out to our skeletal muscles, making our bodies move with whatever movement we have consciously decided to do. There is some subconscious motor control that occurs not in the cerebral cortex, but deeper into our brains, in gray matter pockets known as basal nuclei. These things here that look kind of like eyeballs deep in the brain, these are the areas where we have subconscious motor control. Now, in a person who does not have good subconscious motor control, their arms may not swing when they walk. For instance, if you don't have enough neurotransmitter called dopamine, then you may develop a disease called Parkinson's or Huntington's disease. If you've ever seen someone walk with Parkinson's or Huntington's disease, you'll notice that their gait is somewhat off and perhaps their arms do not swing as they should. So this is necessary here. This subconscious control is necessary for us to have an adequate level of dopamine. Let's talk about the somatic sensory area. We know it's housed in the postcentral gyrus, that is behind this central sulcus, and it's found in the parietal lobe. Now, each of our sensory areas, whether it's vision, hearing, somatic, whatever it is, there are two components. There is a primary area where the sensation is received into the brain, and then there's an association area where your brain makes sense of what is happening in your body. So here, primary sensory cortex is housed in the postcentral gyrus. You'll notice that still in the parietal lobe, we have the association area. Okay, so let me repeat. The primary sensory area is where you initially receive the sensation into the brain. The association area is where your brain makes sense of what's happening in the body. So every one of our sensory areas is going to have a primary and an association area. So this somatic sensory is touch. It's what you can feel. So if you put your hand in your pocket and you feel keys and you feel coins, the sensation of feeling comes in first to that primary area. Making sense of which objects are keys versus which are coins in your pocket, that is going to take place here in the association area. We also have a homunculus for that area as well. It's called the primary somatosensory cortex homunculus. And again, there's a lot of nerve tissue dedicated to areas that receive a lot of input, such as hands and face. Those areas that don't have a lot of sensation or need for a lot of sensation aren't going to have very much surface area here on the surface of this postcentral gyrus. Since we're talking about somatic sensation, I wanted to show you a picture of a person with birth defects resulting from thalidomide. The anti-nausea drug thalidomide was given to women during their pregnancies back in the 1960s. People in Britain were using this drug widely with success. In the United States, we were a little more cautious. In fact, this drug was the reason behind development of the FDA, which regulates drugs. Now, we learned through regulation of this drug and investigation of it that certain babies were born without limbs. So we, of course, didn't want to use this drug for anti-nausea during pregnancy. Now, the interesting thing here is the somatic sensory cortex in the postcentral gyrus still maps out body parts. So even a person born without arms or legs still has mapping in their brain for those body parts. That's how they can have sensations of body parts that aren't even there. Let's now turn our attention to the visual areas. We know the occipital lobe houses the primary visual cortex and its association area. So vision travels along fibers to the back part of your brain, and this occipital lobe not only receives vision from your eyes, but it also interprets what you're seeing. Now, if you're unable to see, you may develop blindness due to damage to the primary visual cortex. However, if you can see but unable to identify what you see or recognize what you see, where do you think the damage might have been done? In the association area. Interesting research done out there nowadays for people who have visual impairments. There are smart glasses that can hook into the occipital lobe of the brain. Interesting thing happens here. If a person had some ability to see early in life, then their brain can then make sense of what's being seen, even if it's been 20 years or 40 years since their brain has had to deal with visual images. The interesting thing about these glasses is this. If a person is born without any kind of vision and their brain never learns to develop the ability to detect images and associate them with anything, then it can be overwhelming. In fact, when this experiment was done, they gave these glasses to a woman in her 20s who lost sight at age 3. She was thrilled because her brain had already learned to map and associate objects. However, they gave these glasses to a man in his 40s, had never seen a day in his life, and it was overwhelming because his brain had not learned to associate and to block out things that are not necessary. So this may be a way of the future for us to be able to aid people who have visual impairment. Let's talk about hearing. In which lobe is hearing housed? Temporal lobe. And of course it's still contralateral, just like vision. That means your left ear's hearing is interpreted by your right temporal lobe, just like your right eye is interpreted by your left occipital lobe. And again, we have a primary auditory cortex and an association area here. So which of these receives the input of hearing first? That is the primary auditory cortex. Now, what is the job of the auditory association area? That makes sense of what you've heard. So a person who has damage to the primary auditory cortex may simply not have any hearing at all. That person may be deaf. But a person who can hear but not understand what they're hearing may have damage done to that association area. So imagine, being hit in the head by a baseball, having a stroke, any kind of brain tissue damage here may impair a person's ability to recognize sounds that they hear. So our last two senses that we're going to discuss are smell and taste. You'll notice that smell and taste are not housed in the same lobe. In fact, smell is housed in the temporal lobe while taste is housed in the parietal lobe. Although in this picture here, that taste gustatory cortex looks like it's drawn in that frontal lobe. So let's talk about general interpretation. The general interpretation of all of our incoming senses occurs in the left hemisphere for most of us. This general interpretive area accumulates sensations from multiple places. What we see, what we hear, taste, smell, and feel all comes here into this general interpretive area for us to make sense of what we're experiencing. There's also a speech center for most of us in the left hemisphere. Notice that I said for most of us. Some people have their speech centers housed in their right hemisphere. Interesting to note, if you're right-handed and you use the telephone, do you also use your right ear for the telephone? If you do, then your speech center is probably housed in your left hemisphere. Now, if you're left-handed and you use the left ear for the telephone, guess where your speech center is probably housed? In the right hemisphere. So just interesting to note that that speech center is probably located in the left hemisphere for most of us, but it can be located in the right hemisphere. So we talked previously about the prefrontal cortex. It is an area of the brain in the frontal lobe that houses personality, behavior, decorum, and even toilet training. It is this prefrontal cortex part of the brain that helps you manage what to say, when to say it, and when not to say those things. Now, back in the 1800s, there was a man named Phineas Gage, who's pictured here. He was working on a railroad, and there was an explosion that drove the pipe in his left hand through his head. It went through the orbit of his eye and out through his brain. You can see it even damaged his skull. Now, unfortunately, this left him with permanent brain damage in the prefrontal cortex. I say he's a case study because until his case, we did not realize what that prefrontal cortex did. There were reports that before this accident that he was a rather calm guy, but after the accident, his personality changed. So he became more angry after this accident occurred. Again, in the 1900s, there were prefrontal lobotomies that essentially took the tissue in the prefrontal cortex and damaged it to the point that it could no longer function. Those lobotomies were performed on young people who may have had, say, a mood disorder, maybe bipolar disorder, or a chemical imbalance. And at that time period, they did not understand what they were doing by damaging that prefrontal cortex. They turned fully functional teenagers into people who were unable to function and perhaps even go to the bathroom on their own. Rosemary Kennedy was one such person who had a prefrontal lobotomy, and her parents and family started the Special Olympics because of that. As it turns out, she had bipolar disorder. Nowadays we know is manageable, but back in that time period, the prefrontal lobotomies were advertised as a way to assist with those kind of brain and mood disorders. All right, very bottom of your page there, lateralization of the hemispheres. We know the left hemisphere tends to control language, math, and logic, while the right hemisphere tends to dominate visual and spatial skills, like hanging a picture on the wall, emotion, and artistic skills. So we don't live with one hemisphere being the only one that operates. Of course, we use both hemispheres, but up until age 16, a person can operate with only one hemisphere. How insane is that, right? If you're up until age 16, you have what's called brain plasticity, meaning that your brain can accommodate for the other missing hemisphere. That doesn't mean it's not without work. It would take rehabilitation to be able to retrain to do some things. But after the mid-teenage years, the brain becomes less plastic and less able to manage without the opposite hemisphere. All right, so that's a lot of material. I encourage you to make page 114 into some flashcards and definitely use the picture to help you study. There's also a worksheet on page 115. Let me take you over to page 117 and we'll talk through the remainder of these brain parts. Now, to help you out, I have bold-faced the terms in your course pack as to what you want to remember. For instance, the cerebellum's major job is muscle coordination of voluntary movements. We know that the spinocerebellar tracts takes joint information and skeletal muscle location information up here to the cerebellum. The cerebellum also has its own motor homunculus that maps out the body, and again, there's a lot of dedication to areas that require a lot of fine-tuned motor skills. The diencephalon includes three components: thalamus, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland. Let's talk about the hypothalamus first. The hypothalamus is found here. Let's circle it right about there. Okay, the thalamus, by contrast, is right here. And if you use your imagination, I hear there's a duck in the brain. In fact, what you're looking at is the duck eye. The duck beak is this area where the pituitary gland is housed. Here's the duck's neck that comes down here for the midbrain. The pons is this piece that sticks out here. And if you had a crested duck, this whole corpus callosum up here on top would be the crest on that duck's head. So if you use your imagination, you can kind of help yourself remember these parts within the brain. Now, the hypothalamus is home to homeostasis. Look at all the functions here that are vital to your survival. Autonomic nervous system control is ANS control. That is all of the automatic responses that occur in your body. Emotional response, body temperature regulation, food intake, which is hunger, water balance, which is thirst, your sleep cycle, and your endocrine system, which is all those hormones, is regulated through the hypothalamus. So we'll talk in great detail about endocrine in our Bio 211 course. Interesting thing to note, ecstasy and other drugs can actually burn out the hypothalamus because its job is to help regulate body temperature. If you damage the hypothalamus, your body temperature's natural setting may reset hotter and hotter until the point that it can burn up your body. That's not a good thing and definitely a reason to avoid drugs like this. Let's talk about the endocrine glands. We know the hypothalamus regulates endocrine glands. There's several major ones in the body that we'll talk about in Bio 211, including the thyroid gland in the neck, thymus in the chest, adrenal glands on top of the kidneys, and pancreas. And of course, there's ovaries for females and testes for males. Let's talk about your thalamus. If I had to remember one thing about your thalamus, it's a relay station. Sensory information that comes up the spinal cord and into the brainstem comes here to this thalamus, and then it's relayed out to the appropriate portion of your cerebral cortex. You may recall those are projection fibers that carry that information to the right part of your cerebral cortex. So regulating that sensory information and where it goes is the job of the thalamus. The sleep-wake cycle is also a job here. We'll talk about that in just a bit when we discuss the limbic system and the reticular activating system. Here you can see those spinothalamic pathways right here. They are coming up the spinal cord in white matter. They pass through the thalamus, which I'm circling right now, and these are projection fibers that take that information out to the appropriate portion of your brain's cerebral cortex. The last one here of our diencephalon is the pituitary gland. It carries a very close relationship with the hypothalamus. In fact, the hypothalamus regulates what the pituitary gland does. The pituitary gland is a major endocrine gland. You'll see here it sits in sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Don't worry about the pituitary's details. We will hit that one in Bio 211. That's going to be a major part of the first portion of that course. Let's talk about the brainstem. The brainstem has three components: pons, medulla oblongata, and midbrain. You can see here this big large area is the thalamus, and if we head down below, the midbrain is hidden right underneath it, right in this area there. The pons is here, and then down below, that's the medulla oblongata. The pons controls breathing. And the midbrain is actually an area here that includes these four little bumps called the corpora quadrigemina, and it's a reflex control center. So things like blinking, for instance, are routed through that midbrain. Now, let's take a look at our very last page of content, and that's going to be the limbic system and the reticular activating system. The limbic system is an old, ancient part of the brain, and it's rooted in the amygdala and the hippocampus. These are not parts that we normally learn in lab. So you can see the amygdala sits down here below the thalamus and hypothalamus region, and the hippocampus sits nearby. So this limbic system is an ancient system that is based on sensory input, and it helps us to form memories and emotions. One great example that I can give you here is if you have, say, a memory of a grandparent or a memory of a favorite relative. Perhaps that person had a particular smell of cologne or perfume. If that person dies and is long gone, you can smell that perfume or cologne on somebody else many, many years later and immediately have a flashback of where you smelled that odor before. So interesting, things like smell don't actually route through the thalamus, so they go straight here to the limbic system to help us make memories and emotions. So it's a very powerful system. That's why, tragic memories, very happy memories, fun times are often etched in our memory because it travels through this limbic system, and your brain helps to make memories out of that emotional state. Just another view of that amygdala and hippocampus relationship in the brain. And finally, the reticular formation system is actually based on the thalamus. So you'll notice its sensory information comes up through the spinal cord, up through the brainstem, and when it arrives here at the midbrain, you can see right there, and this thalamus right above it, that's going to be where we route out this information to other parts of the brain. So if there's a somatic sensation, it goes to the postcentral gyrus. If it's something else, perhaps it travels to the right part of the brain, and that's the routing spot or the relay station for that information. So it is that reticular system here that helps to screen out unnecessary information. For instance, if you're not consciously thinking about your clothes, but they're on your body, you don't need to feel your clothes on your body every second of every day. So the reticular system here helps to screen out and remove those unnecessary nerve impulses. Your brain has enough to think about without constantly thinking about wearing clothes, I'm wearing clothes, I'm wearing clothes, I'm wearing glasses, I'm wearing jewelry. So all that stuff is screened out. Drugs like LSD actually relieve the RAS system of that screening ability and allows for nerve impulses to reach the brain that normally would not. So interesting, LSD was a popular recreational drug back in the 70s, but nowadays it's being researched for its use in migraines, especially cluster migraines. All right, so that should take us through to the end of this chapter. Please let me know if you have any questions.